In this video we can see the very first train that crossed the Kerch railway bridge, better known as the Crimean Bridge, linking the Taman Peninsula in Russia with Kerch in occupied Crimea. The idea of building a bridge between Crimea and Russia goes back a very long time. Indeed, this railway bridge, or this bridge indeed, is not the first. In this video I'm going to talk about the very first railway bridge and its destruction. I'm doing this on the 9th of October 2022. On the 8th of October 2022, there was an explosion on the Crimean Bridge, which I presume was done by the Ukrainian military, although all sorts of other theories are being put forward at the moment. Many words used to describe it include that of destroyed. The railway bridge is not destroyed, and in my opinion, although I am not an engineer, it looks to me as though it could be up and running very quickly. Nonetheless, if it denied even a day's worth of supplies coming over that bridge, then for the Ukrainian army it was worth doing. Currently, there are only 2 railway routes into the area of Kherson. There's this one from across Crimea, and the second one runs through the Donetsk and Zaporizhia oblasts, and that is under Ukrainian artillery attack. So it was worth doing. But let's now go back in history and talk about the very first bridge. Now, the strange thing about the bridge itself is that the idea to build a bridge here didn't actually start in Russia, but the first one came from the United Kingdom. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was the idea of building a telegraph line from the UK to India, and part of that would have had to run across the Kerch Strait. Anyway, nobody financed that, so that actually didn't come to anything. Nonetheless, in 1903, Tsar Nicholas II became interested in the idea of building a bridge. Seeing that the Tsar ordered some of his best engineers to actually look into the work. In the city archives in Kerch, we find an 8-page study suggesting 2 options for routes of railway lines, which were drawn up by the city authorities in Temryuk. Temryuk is located on the Taman Peninsula. This project dates to before May 1911. We can also find this map of a proposed railway line across the Kerch Strait from Bagharovo in Crimea to Abinskaya, today called Abinsk, from the same time. The First World War started and then it was shelved. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union had other problems on its hands, but in the 1930s it came back on the table. This bridge would have been part of a railway line that would have gone from Kherson through Crimea and down the coast of the Black Sea on the eastern side. That, however, required assistance from other countries. In 1939, that assistance was possible thanks to the alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Parts were ordered in Germany, but in June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and that was the end of this alliance between these 2 countries. However, it wasn't the end of the idea of a bridge across the Kerch Strait. If you read Albert Speer's book, Inside the Third Reich, you will come across references to a cableway which is built across the Kerch Strait. Now, sometime in 1942, as the Nazi forces were advancing in the Caucasus and on Stalingrad, the idea to build a cable car across the strait were made. So Crimea was occupied completely by the Nazis in the summer of 1942, and the idea seems to have come from there quite quickly. Of course, it wasn't so essential as it became after the Battle of Stalingrad and the advance of the Soviet forces towards Rostov-on-Don. The cable car itself was opened on the 14th of June 1943, and now I'm going to quote the words of Albert Speer in his book, that he said it could deliver 1,000 tons of cargo per day, which provided for the needs of the German 17th Army. 1,000 tons of cargo per day is very impressive considering it is a cableway, which you can see in this photograph. Sometime in the spring of 1943, again quoting Speer, Hitler came up with the idea of building a 5-kilometre long road and railway bridge across the Kerch Strait, and that would have supported a subsequent invasion into the Caucasus. Maybe Hitler all the time thought he was going to get the oil in that area, which is the reason excuse I should say, why he hung on to the Taman Peninsula. Now, the construction started, but it never actually got anywhere close to being completed. Naturally, Soviet intelligence took a keen interest in the transport infrastructure behind enemy lines. On the 22nd of July 1943, this report from the railway troops of the North Caucasus Front was made, which concerned the construction and beginning of operations of the Kerch cableway. In this map of the same date, we can see the railway infrastructure in the Taman Peninsula, which includes the cableway. Photographic intelligence of the cableway was obtained on the 18th and 19th of July 1943, and the Chief of Staff of the 44th Railway Brigade, Lieutenant General Ney, wrote to the Deputy Chief of the Railway Troops of the North Caucasian Front in this message of the 29th of July 1943. The first that the Soviets knew of the construction of a more permanent reinforced concrete structure appears to be this report of Lieutenant Colonel Yatsino, Chief of the Railway Troops of the North Caucasian Front, to the headquarters of the Railway Troops of the Soviet Union. Here we can see a diagram of the construction works made by Soviet intelligence as of the 27th of August 1943, and this diagram is dated the 20th of September of 1943. Analysis dated the 27th of October 1943 was provided by the intelligence services attached to the 44th Railway Brigade on railway infrastructure in the Taman Peninsula, together with information relating to the bridge, which was then under construction. As the German forces were forced to retreat from the area of Kerch, the cable car was destroyed in parts, and in other places it was dismantled, but the Soviet army was able to capture large amounts of material and then use this material itself. Now, on the 25th of January 1944, the State Defense Committee adopted a resolution that it would build a railway bridge across the strait, and this had to be finished by the 15th of July 1944. And what's odd about this is it shows a great deal of forward planning, because even Kerch was still in the hands of the Nazis, and Kerch was not captured by the Red Army until the 11th of April 1944. And this meant that by the time that Kerch was captured, the design was already underway, and preparatory and construction work had even started in the territory that was held by the Red Army. Now, as today, this was at risk of air attack, and to prevent a possible air assault on the bridge, there was installed 470 anti-aircraft guns, 294 anti-aircraft machine guns. There were 96 fighters, 2 radar stations, and 132 searchlights. That is a huge amount of effort to defend this bridge. Very few Soviet military bases, or even cities for that matter, had such a cover given to them. So it's clear, of course, that the deadlines that were set were totally unrealistic, and the construction of the bridge took 7 months. Before construction of the bridge could begin, the Kerch Strait needed to be cleared of mines, and one way of doing this was to use depth charges to get rid of them, which we can see here. Once the strait was considered demined, floating wooden pile drivers went into action, which drove metal piles into the sea. In this photograph, wooden piles are being delivered via pontoons. This shows lifting a portable pile driver, and here we have a pile driver doing what it's supposed to be doing. At the same time, metal supports for the bridge were constructed nearby. This demonstrates that despite the requirements of the front, the Soviet Union placed a great deal of urgency in the building of this bridge, resources for which, by the summer of 1944, would probably have been much more usefully deployed elsewhere. The first train from Crimea actually passed over the bridge on the 3rd of November 1944. By this time, all of Crimea had been captured, and most of the earthworks were done, and some of the necessary protection from storms and ice was also underway. However, this now proved to be a problem. There was a storm that began around the 11th of December 1944. A telegram was sent to Moscow about the storm on the 26th of December. This storm has gone on for 15 days. The entire trestle is completely covered in ice. Water is coming over the overpass. We can't remove a tugboat. We can't do anything for the floating crane. The piles are being damaged. The wind is so strong that people are being knocked over. We keep changing personnel, but they can't stand it. We can't do any work. Waves are up to 2 meters in height. The restoration of the bridge cannot be completed within 2 weeks. Well, it wasn't just 2 weeks. In fact, this storm did even more damage. On the 18th of February 1945, a northeast wind coming from the Sea of Azov destroyed 32 of the supports. And there were 5 ice cutters, but only 5, and more were probably needed. Span structures then fell into the sea. On the 20th of February 1945, 42 pillars were damaged, and this in turn led to even more problems. Having said that, there were a lot of the infrastructure around it, the earthworks, that actually survived. Now, why did this happen? Well, they hadn't thought about the winter, which is quite odd considering them in Russia. This could have been quite embarrassing because the Yalta Conference took place in February 1945, in which Europe was divided up. This was the big 3 at the conference, or as I would like to say, the big 1, and the other 2 who were begging the big 1 to do things for them. The big 1, of course, was Roosevelt, and the other 2 were Stalin and Churchill. The fact that the first bridge had fallen into the sea doesn't seem to have put off the Soviet leadership. Indeed, in the archives in Kerch, we find a great deal of correspondence concerning the construction of a new bridge. This correspondence involved such characters as Stalin, Kaganovich, and Beria, amongst others. This shows that these considerations were thought about at a very high level. On the 5th of February 1945, there is a message from the People's Commissar of Railways, the Railways Minister, I.V. Kovalev. He informed Stalin then that the Kerch Railway Bridge had been destroyed. On the 10th of March 1945, N.F. Kosoreva, who was an engineer, wrote to the Commissariat of Railways for the Soviet Union about the possibilities of building a new temporary bridge across the Kerch Strait. But this was taken even further on the 31st of July 1945, because we find these drawings which suggest how the bridge could be built. Here we have a architect's drawing of the middle part of the bridge, and here we have how it could look on the Crimean coast. This correspondence continued for quite a while. However, at the end, it was decided not to build it. Allegedly, what happened was an engineer presented the plans to Stalin, and he said, "This will be a Tsar bridge." And Stalin responded, "We got rid of the Tsar in 1917. And that was the cue to build a ferry terminal. To rebuild the bridge would have cost an absolute fortune, which the Soviet government decided that it didn't have. Even after Ukraine became independent, proposals were made, but they never came to anything. Will the current Crimean bridge survive? Now, that which is a good question, but I can't answer it. I would hope that after the liberation of Crimea, that it would survive. It's an engineering marvel, and it's pointless destroying infrastructure. I do appreciate what it represents, and I'm going to give another example of what it represents. Looking back at things that went through my life, and that is, for example, the Palace of Culture in Warsaw, which it represented the Soviet occupation of Poland. And there were demands to actually knock it down. I mean, I always thought, well, first of all, it's pretty daft because the office space is needed. And not only that, it's been there for such a long time. And I do appreciate that for older people, this is a memory. And there was this joke in Warsaw. You could see the Palace of Culture from anywhere in the city, which isn't true, and certainly isn't true now because so many other tall buildings have been built around it. And as far as the Crimean Bridge, I appreciate that it is a symbol of the imperialism, the aggression against Ukraine, and racism. But at the same time, this symbol serves a useful purpose. So therefore, I would urge that after Crimea is liberated, and hopefully after Russia itself is liberated from the Putin dictatorship, that this bridge will stand and be given a name such as the Russian-Ukrainian People's Friendship Bridge or something along those lines. Unfortunately, at the time I'm doing this, there is a war on, and that is a dream which, to be quite honest, seems particularly difficult at the moment. So I hope you found that interesting. Thanks very much for watching this. If you've got any questions, then do try and put them below. And all the best from me in Poland.